Hey everybody, and welcome back. A lot of you have been asking about how to host websites now that we've set up multiple layers of security within our home lab. And what seems like it should be a straightforward question, as always, it's far more nuanced than that. So I want to take this opportunity to walk through 3 of my top picks for what I think are good but different web servers. Now, if I haven't picked yours, don't hate me. There are a million different web servers out there, and they're all great within their own niche. But I wanted to take the approach of something that was easy to use, WordPress, albeit you can get into the weeds with that, more on that later. Something that was more highly configurable, something like Nginx, and then something that was designed to be static, which is mainly for static content or those where there's more of a security focus. So something like Hugo. So for each of those 3, we'll have a look at the compose files and we'll walk through the deployment process as well as setting up some of the initial configuration steps. And hopefully by the end of this video, you'll have some knowledge around the different types of web servers and how to deploy 3 of the most popular. So let's jump right into it. So the first product I want to focus on is WordPress. And as I alluded to in the introduction, it's a bit of a double-edged sword. On the face of it, and pretty much the reason I've chosen it, is because it gives you a nice and intuitive web interface to configure your entire website. Now, WordPress is the most popular content management system in the world. I think it attributes to something like 68%. But under the hood, you can get into the weeds. So whilst on the surface, it looks easy and simple to use, you can find yourself in difficulty if you start changing things. But having said that, the reason I enjoy WordPress is just there's so much community support given its market share. It's simple to install new plugins and new themes, for example, and you can see a load of them on the screen here. These are typically applied conveniently through the GUI, and you can just click a button and install it. And there's a ton of advanced features that you can get if you're willing to pay for them, and you can pretty much customize WordPress to whatever you want. Now, WordPress is PHP based and it's dynamic in nature. So, as I mentioned before, there's a key difference between a static site and a dynamic site. A dynamic site is going to change when you visit it. Typically, it will have interactions and a back-end database. So things like leaving a comment, for example, or it building new pages when it's rendered, etc. That differs from a static page, so something like a branding page for a company, where you would expect the same experience every time you load that page. And we'll get onto that in a bit. So WordPress boasts a number of really handy features, and that's probably a reason why it's the #1 chosen platform. And the admin dashboard is really powerful for managing all aspects of your WordPress deployment. And things like Phpmyadmin, which we'll deploy in this setup, will also be used for managing its backend database. And that's where that dynamic nature comes into it. Other web servers we'll deploy today don't have to have a backend database. And there's pretty much limitless off-the-shelf customization with things like WordPress themes and WordPress plugins. And there's a whole host of other third-party applications and plugins that you can put into your WordPress site. So let's now jump into the deployment of WordPress, and then we can have a look at this up and running within our lab. So to do that, we're going to be using Docker. Now, this is an intimidating looking Docker compose file. I appreciate that, but it's nothing too different from what we've used before. So this is another multi-container deployment, and it consists of the WordPress container, the Phpmyadmin for administrating the database, and the actual database itself. And there's a few options you can do around the database. It doesn't have to be MySQL, I've chosen that. You could use another version such as MariaDB. You can decide on that one. So the WordPress container is pretty straightforward, and I've handily put in the traffic labels here for you so that you can run this through your reverse proxy traffic. This container is going to connect to the database. As I said, this is a dynamic web server, and to do that it needs to be on the right networks, and it's going to need some persistence. So the key thing with this deployment is that we pass it the conf.ini, the config file. We'll get onto that in a minute. It's also going to take some variables from a .env file, which we've seen before in previous videos. And thankfully, there aren't too many things that we need to configure to get this up and running. The next container is optional, but I recommend you spin it up. and this is the Phpmyadmin for managing your database. Again, this is pretty straightforward. It needs a connection to the database, and again, it's going to take environment variables. The good thing here is we specify one environment variable and it will apply to all of the containers. We want to give it some traffic labels to access this through our proxy with SSL, and that's pretty much it for this container. The last one is the database, and as I say, I've chosen to use MySQL, but you could use MariaDB here. And this one is straightforward again. We need a volume to store the data for persistence reasons. We need to specify a password and a username when we create that database. And we need to put it on the same network as the other containers so it can be accessed. Once that's done, we're pretty much ready to spin this up. But we just need to tweak the .env file and make sure that we've got the folder structure that it expects. So you'll see that I've specified the Docker IP address here. I've changed the port, but we don't necessarily need to do that. Just change it if you've got a conflict. Most of that will be resolved by running it through the traffic proxy and using the traffic load balancer. Here you specify the password and the database name, so make sure you go and change that password, but I'll be leaving it as password just for this demonstration. So once you've done that, you need to make sure that the folder structure exists for your bind mounts. In my example, that's going to be located here in the /docker/WordPress. And I've also created the config file, which you can see over here in the WordPress itself, that php.conf.ini. Do make sure that you create that prior to deploying the container stack. Otherwise, this is going to get created as a directory and not a file, and it's going to cause a whole host of errors. In this config file, you just want to specify a few variables, and you can tweak these to your setup, but it does expect it on runtime, so make sure it's there. You can always come back to this at a later date and redeploy your container to pick up the new changes. Once you've got this set up, you're now ready to go and hit deploy. So let's head into our command line and spin up this container. So to do that, we're going to use the standard sudo docker compose up -d, and the first time you run this, it's going to pull those images and start building it. Once it's completed, fingers crossed, you should get a message that says started. Let's quickly check the logs in Portainer to make sure that everything went to plan. So over in Portainer, and we can now log in with OAuth. If you haven't checked my other video, go and do so. We can see that the 3 containers have all started and they're running. So let's check the database. That all looks fine, and it's listening on port 3306, which is what we expected. The Phpmyadmin, that all looks fine. There's a warning about not using an FQDN, but we can fix that if needed, but it's not strictly necessary. And the final one is actually WordPress itself. And again, a similar warning, but we're okay to ignore that one. Everything looks like it's up and running. So fingers crossed now, I should be able to go to wordpress.jimsgarage.co.uk and access my WordPress site. Typically, you'd want to change this to your actual subdomain for your website or your root domain, whatever you want it to be. And there we have it. We've got the installation interface for WordPress. So let's quickly rattle through this. Make sure you fill this in properly if you're going to be using this for production, but just for testing purposes, I'm going to fill this in quickly and get on to the next steps. Now that that's completed, we can hit the install button, and that'll go away in the background and start installing WordPress. Once that's successful, we can hit the login button and then log in with the username and password that you just created. So once we hit login, we should be greeted with the WordPress dashboard. And this is what I was talking about the ease of which it is to administrate WordPress. But equally, that comes with some complexity, and if you're not careful, you might make changes that break things. And there's also a flip side to having all of these plugins and themes readily available, and that is things like this here. You've consistently got to be making sure that you keep your plugins up to date, because if you let them get too old, there's obviously vulnerabilities that are going to be discovered. But I don't want to cause undue concern. Just understand that the more plugins you implement, the greater the attack surface, and the more that you need to make sure you've got a robust patching policy in place. Also, you might have dependencies on plugins, etc. that become deprecated, and you might not be able to find that functionality elsewhere. So just bear that in mind. Now, one of the cool things with WordPress is we can actually just preview the site quite simply. So if we hit visit site, it's actually created a default site when you create the container. So here's a hello world, and it looks like it's a sample page for a blog, which is probably a good thing to have on your home lab. And if you want to, when you're on this page, you can edit this template. So remember, this is just the template you're seeing. Lots of different templates have lots of different features, some of which are behind a paywall. But if you click edit a site, you can do simple things like add a header, add a footer. Whereas if this was something like deployed on Nginx that wasn't a theme, i.e. something that's customizable with code, you'd have to go and build all of this out. You wouldn't be able to do it through a fancy GUI like here. And now if you wanted to change the actual theme, so what it looks like, again, that's really simple. And you can do all of this through the UI, as opposed to having to copy files over to your web server and redeploy your web server. So if we just go onto the appearance and click themes, I don't know, why don't we do the 2021 theme? So if we click activate, that should now be active. And if we go and view our site, there you go, you can see it's been applied. And it really is that simple. That's kind of one of the beauties of WordPress, is that user interface and that simplicity to just make changes. Other important areas of WordPress is obviously things like the user access management. So you can create different user accounts for different people you want to give access to your website. So that could be for people to go in and edit, write posts, collaborate, etc. And you can define and add those permissions within the user settings page. So I appreciate that's a very quick whistle-stop tour of WordPress. There's a ton more functionality underneath the hood. Please do go and read the documentation. But I'll quickly show you the Phpmyadmin and what that does now. So if I head to pma.jimsgarage.co.uk, we should reach the web GUI for that page. And here you can see that we've reached the Phpmyadmin page. And to log in, we use the username of root and the password that you specified within your environment file. So when you log in, you're greeted with the dashboard for Phpmyadmin, and this will allow you to do queries and changes and look at the data within the database for your WordPress deployment. And here you can see all the various tables within your database, and this is the bit where I say you're given access, but don't go messing around in here unless you know exactly what you're doing, because it could fundamentally just break your whole WordPress deployment. Don't say you haven't been warned. But with this setup, you've got a really powerful tool that's quick to deploy, easy to administrate, and gives you low-level granular access if you need it. So that's going to conclude our brief tour of WordPress. And now we're going to move over to Nginx. So let's jump into the Docker Compose file, have a quick look through, and then we'll get it up and running. Now, Nginx is a huge player in the world of web servers. And did I say web server? Well, it does a lot more than that. It can be a load balancer, a proxy, reverse proxy, a mail server, and probably a ton of other things that I don't even know about. Nginx is used extensively throughout big enterprise, and you'll see it pretty much in all walks of life. The reason I've chosen it is pretty much for that reason. It's a bit like a Swiss Army knife. It's got all of the tools that you're ever likely to need, and you can customize and choose those as you wish. The downside is a lot of that requires a lot of learning and expertise and understanding of how to use those features, and moreover, how to use those securely. So let's jump into a simple setup where we're going to be using Nginx as a web server only. So whilst many people will be using this as a reverse proxy, and there's nothing wrong with that, we're going to have this sat behind Traffic, which is just a reverse proxy. I quite like the idea of having one app for one purpose. But there's nothing wrong with using Nginx for multiple purposes. So I'm going to deploy the Nginx that I've done in previous videos, and it's really straightforward. The crucial part really is that you have these bind mounts. Now, the first one is where you store templates for your websites, and the second one is actually where you're going to store your website. So whilst there isn't a nice GUI interface like WordPress, what you can do is drag and drop pre-built websites into an Nginx container. So typically you would be coding your website in your IDE, and then you would port it out to an Nginx web server. Then the web server would host those files and you'd be able to access it through your browser. So in this setup, there shouldn't be anything new here. We simply specified the name of the host, we've given it a port, and then we've put the traffic labels so that we can access this through the traffic reverse proxy. So let's go and deploy this, and we'll see what happens when we reach this page, which in my case is just nginx.jimsgarage.co.uk. Again, you'd probably want to change that to something more friendly. So navigating to where this Docker Compose file is stored, we just simply want to run the same up command. And once that's done, it should be up and running. We can quickly check in Portainer just to make sure that everything went well. In Portainer, you can see here that this container is running, and if we check the logs, everything looks like it's ready. So let's head over to that URL now and let's see this in action. So if I go over to Nginx, let's hit return, and there we go. It's the same rickroll that we had in the previous video where we ran Nginx behind Authentic with a web proxy, similar to Authelia. And this is where you can start to see the customizability of Nginx. It's basically just a web server. It's going to host the content you give it. It's not going to be used to create the content. So you're going to have to whip out, like I say, your IDE and get programming. So you're going to need to get some HTML, CSS, etc. experience. And that again opens up the possibility of hosting both dynamic and static sites within Nginx. So we're going to get onto a static site after this one, but you could configure Nginx to use a static website. So it wouldn't have any connections to backend databases, etc. As I said, Nginx gives you all of the tools to create what you want. It's a bit of a sandbox. So in this instance, if we want to change this web page, we'd need to change the files in the bind mount. So let's have a quick look at how to do that. So if I head back to my Docker Compose, you can see that the files we need to change are in these bind mounts. Now this location is here on my host, and you can see that there's an index.html. Now that will be your default homepage within Nginx. And any change we want to make to the website behind us, we'd need to edit these files. Now, I don't recommend you go and edit it like I'm going to show you in this demonstration. You need to get something like VS Code or WebStorm, or something like that, where you want a fully fledged web IDE to do all of this programming for you. The flip side is you can obviously just buy templates that are pre-compiled, drag and drop them in here, and then refresh the page. So if I wanted to tweak the page here, I could just nano into here, and then if I wanted to delete or change the title, I could just delete it here. I could save that file, and then hopefully when I refresh this web page, that title should be gone, which it is. So if you're wanting to get a quick and easy professional looking web page, you could go to somewhere like ThemeForest and pick up one of their pre-made templates. Now, most of these will cost money, but they should come with some support. And I do recommend obviously you go away and learn how to do some web programming if you're going to want to host a website. Certainly if it's more in a professional sense, because you want to know how to fix things when they break. So here you can see loads of different things, lots of videos playing, cursor being followed on the mouse, lots of advanced features that just simply isn't available within WordPress. And advanced features and specialisms is something that Hugo is no exception to. And whilst I said that Nginx can be used to deploy static sites, that's exactly what Hugo has been created to do. You can see on the front, the world's fastest framework for building websites. And those websites are static. Now the brilliant thing with Hugo is typically you would integrate this into your CI/CD pipeline, so you would build your site and then ship it out pre-containerized in Hugo to deploy that website at scale. And with static content, you know that you're going to get the same experience no matter when you visit that page. Plus it comes with some security benefits because there's a smaller attack surface, because there's less things going on. There isn't a database to call back to, etc. So I'm not going to go too in depth into what Hugo is and how you would incorporate it into that build process, but what we will go through today is how to build a site and how to deploy Hugo, and we'll get that up and running for you. And if you're wondering whether a static website is going to compromise on things like the quality, this isn't a brilliant example. But this website here on the page is running the exact same page that Nginx was running, and it looks exactly the same. It pretty much has all of that functionality, except it won't have the dynamism built into it. So typically you wouldn't have things like, I don't know, user comments that would change the content of the web page over time. So to deploy Hugo, it's slightly different to the previous containers. And that's because we need to create a site and then deploy the container. So that site has to exist first. Now to do that, you run it through Hugo itself. And in this case, we're going to run it using the Hugo container, but you don't have to do it that way. You could integrate it into your CI/CD pipeline, for example. So if we open up the Docker Compose file, thankfully it's pretty straightforward. We're going to pull the container down, give it a name. We're going to run a command, which is server, which is important. That instructs the Hugo container to act as a server to serve the web pages. We're going to feed it once we've created the site first. After that, it's plain sailing. We're going to mount some files, i.e. the website we want to serve, to the /source folder within Hugo, and then we're going to give it some proxy labels so that we can access this through our reverse proxy with SSL. Great stuff. So don't go and deploy this yet. As I said, there's a prerequisite. So handily, I've got this file here which shows the command that we need to run. All of this will be available on my GitHub. So let's open that and have a look. So the command we need to run is as follows. And this is going to run the command temporarily within a Docker container. Once it's completed the command, it's going to shut down and get rid of that container. So it's going to deploy the files within the current working directory. And it's going to pull down the image 101, which is the latest. And the important bit is the command here. It's actually going to create a new site called Jim's Garage, and it's going to put that in the format of a YAML file. So let's copy this and paste it into our terminal, and let's see what happens. So pasting this into the terminal and hitting return. Didn't find the image, it's going to pull it. Once it's pulled it, it will then build it, and hopefully with any luck, within the folder we're working in here, we should get the output of this command. So now that's completed and it's presented the following output. Everything seems fine. Let's refresh our page here, and you can see now that Jim's Garage has been created. Let's have a quick look inside. So this is basically the format of a Hugo deployment. And it's not too dissimilar to what you would see in an Nginx deployment, where typically you would have an index.html, you'd have a number of other HTML pages for all the various pages, you'd have CSS files, assets with pictures, JavaScript, a whole host of other stuff. And this is pretty similar. The bit that we'd be interested in is in the static folder, and that's where you'd put your web files. Other bits, you would put other things, so content, data, themes, etc. But the important thing now is we're ready to go and deploy this test website. So what we need to do is copy these files, so the ones that it's printed out here, this whole root Jim's Garage, and we're going to need to put it in this location in my instance. So I'm going to copy that over now, and then I'm going to get ready to deploy it. So I've now copied those files over into the Hugo bind mount location, and you can see all of those here. So now we're getting into a position where we can deploy this. But before I do that, I've just copied over the index.html file, which is the same one I used in the Nginx deployment, just so there's something to present when we deploy this, and just so we know it's working. So let's head to our command line and let's deploy this container. So to do that, we're just going to do the same sudo docker compose up-d, and because it's already pulled the image in the previous command when it generated the site, it should start up really quickly. Now I should be able to head to my website .jimsgarage.co.uk and we should all get rickrolled again. Let's test that out. So hitting return here, brilliant, we can see that it's still working. Now we have Hugo deployed and it's serving us static HTML web content. Now again, like Nginx, there's no fancy user interface etc. But thankfully, due to the open source nature of Hugo and millions of kind folk around the world, we can go onto their website and there's a ton of themes that are available that you can simply import into your Hugo web server. So you would build a new site with one of these templates and you could then serve that on your website. You'd simply then need to edit the HTML to make sure that it matches up with your content and what you want to say. The key here being that it's designed to be a static web page, so you won't be inputting or making any edits directly through the web browser. You'll have to use that IDE to make those changes, and then you'll have to redeploy the website. Now, I've barely touched any of these web servers. I've probably done them a massive disservice, but hopefully I've whetted your appetite in terms of what's available, the different types of web servers you might want to use, and some of the use cases for choosing them. WordPress is going to give you that simple GUI to interact with, but unless you know what's going on under the hood, you might run into some difficulties later down the line. Nginx is going to give you that sandbox to do pretty much whatever you want, and you're pretty much as strong as your coding capabilities or the templates that you want to use. And then you've got Hugo, which is a totally different mindset. It's designed specifically for static sites, and you need to understand some of the constraints that come with it, but also realize some of the benefits of using static sites, which you can do in Nginx as well, around increased security due to the lack of external callouts to things like databases and plugins, etc. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, there's simply too many web servers to go over. So sorry if I didn't call out your favorite. There are tons of other great choices out there that you can go and have a look at and use. So thanks for watching, everybody. Please like, comment and subscribe. Let me know which one you're going to choose and why, and it'd be great to see some of the projects that you have in mind. Take care, everybody. See you on the next one.